Bricks and Minifigs is your one-stop shop for all things LEGO. Hit the link below to find a store near you.
Hi, my name is Jack Carlson, also known as Big Planes on YouTube, and this is my enormous American Airlines DC-10. It is finally here. I've had this done for about 6 months now. I documented the build of this on my YouTube channel, and I built most of it last summer, and I finished the rest of it this year. And yeah, so I'll try to go through all the details of this plane. I'll also try to go through some of the history of this, because this plane has a lot of history. In some ways, it's a lot like the Boeing airplane today, the 737 MAX, and in some ways it isn't. But this is a very historic airplane. It has a lot of history with it. It has a lot of history with American Airlines, and a lot of history with early aviation or early wide-body aviation in the early 70s. So we'll just get right into it then. So with the history of the color scheme here, I chose the American Airlines chrome livery, and this was very intentional because I wanted to build a chrome American Airlines DC-10. I've actually wanted to do one of these for quite a bit, and I did a 757 back in 2020. It worked out pretty well. I learned a lot about using these type of pieces with that and the limitations of building with metallic silver, because metallic silver is a pretty limited part. It's not available in a lot of colors, or not a lot of colors, in a lot of options. So I'm really restricted with what I can do. So thankfully, recently, new pieces have come out. New parts that have existed already have been remolded in metallic silver. So I was actually able to give a shot at the larger airplane in this color scheme. So that's why I decided to build a silver DC-10. And I know a lot of people are going to be thinking this. All of the parts here are authentic silver Lego pieces. Oh, it looks like the lights just went out. It's been a long show. The batteries have been running a while. But yeah, all of the parts on this are authentic, except for 4 pieces in the front, which I had to get custom chromed just because I wanted it to look perfect. I didn't want to have to compromise and have a subpar shape. But by and large, 99.9% of the parts in this are real Lego silver pieces. They took many years to track down, and I don't want to try to think about the cost. Thankfully, I was able to get a lot of it for a pretty good deal through lug bulk and that type of stuff. But yeah, it was tricky to build it in this colored scheme because of the limited parts, especially in plate selection and brick selection. Thankfully, the slope selection has improved recently, but plate and brick selection especially has been the main limiting factor with building this.
So an iconic airplane, like you said, and you've got kind of these reference images around here. So what particular sort of like era would you say this one that you built represents?
Yeah, so this is a DC-10-10. So this would have been one of the first DC-10s off the production line in the early 70s. So this is set around 1970, 1971. And this was designed to compete with the Boeing 747, which was the first wide-body aircraft at the time. And once Boeing came out with the 747, it was a little bit of a shock to the rest of the industry, because up until then, they mainly used narrow-body jets like the 707, DC-8. So when the 747 came out, it kind of really rattled up the airline industry, because all of a sudden you have this airplane that's at least twice the size. It can carry 2-3 times as many people, can fly long distances, and all of a sudden it kind of democratized the ability for people just to travel, and that was really great. So Douglas Aircraft Company at the time really wanted to get in on that, and they decided to go the slightly more conservative route and use technologies that already somewhat existed in the industry that they've learned from their DC-8, and they funneled them into the DC-10. The main competitor for this was actually not the 747, it was the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar. And that plane, although being a little bit more advanced, really struggled from delays. It had a lot of problems with its engines, it had a lot of problems with its avionics. So that one actually came into service quite a bit after this one. So that's kind of interesting to see how that came out. But this was, I think, the second wide body to ever be introduced in the US, I'm pretty sure ever, and it was pretty revolutionary for its time. It was pretty comfortable to fly on, and it had a lot going for it, which is why I'm going to try to get to some of the history of this plane too, because it had a few problems when it first came out, I alluded to earlier in the video. Some of them were the fault of Douglas, or later McDonnell Douglas, and some of them were just bad luck. So I guess the first incident I'll talk about is the cargo door, because that's what this plane is kind of famous for to a lot of people, is the cargo door sometimes blew out and caused a rapid decompression. So the first time that happened was actually on an American Airlines plane just like this, and the cargo door blew out. The pilots were able to safely land it, although it was a warning that they should have addressed that problem better. And later, I believe it was a Turkish Airlines flight, I don't know, I don't remember exactly, but I believe it was a Turkish Airlines flight, had the exact same problem, but unfortunately in this case the plane crashed. So that caused a pretty big controversy at the time, because it had come out that Douglas had actually known about the problem, and they had kind of swept it under the rug. They just put out a notice that the airlines should check the doors before they close them, essentially. And after that, they went in and thoroughly redesigned the door to properly lock, and that was pretty much all of the issues they had with the cargo door, if I'm not mistaken. Another incident involving this exact type of plane, not the same tail number, but the exact type of plane, a DC-10-10, occurred in Chicago, I believe I think it was 1971. It might have been 1970, but I think it was 70. It was in the mid-70s. I can't remember the exact date, but regardless, this one's also quite famous because one of the engines actually came off. Now, this was ultimately found to be a maintenance problem. It wasn't actually a design problem on the airplane. The American Airlines maintenance crews were using a forklift to remove and reattach the engines on the plane, which caused microscopic stress fractures to form and eventually caused the whole engine to fall off. And that one's specifically pretty unfortunate because had the circumstances been slightly different, the plane would have been recoverable. Although that was probably the most famous accident involving the DC-10, which, whether it deserved it or not, somewhat tarnished its reputation early on. And of course, the plane would go on to serve for another 30, 40 years as the backbone of American Airlines, and many other airlines for that matter. And it had a pretty good safety record after that. It just had a little bit of a rough start at the beginning. So that's kind of a good way to summarize the history of this plane. It is very iconic. It's one of the only a few tri-jets that has the third engine in the tail. And I really wanted to capture that really spirit of like the early 70s aviation in Lego. And eventually when we get into the inside of the plane, the interior, you'll really get to see some of the bright and vibrant seat colors and upholstery choices that they decided to go with for this plane.
You mentioned the engine in the tail, which is a kind of bizarre looking design. When you look at like photos of the plane, it almost has like a cartoonish effect to it, like a Futurama thing or something like that. So talk a little bit more about like the reasons for that, and then also kind of how you captured that here on the build.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So the number 2 engine is the one nested in the tail, and like the L-1011, it had a third engine because they wanted to be able to fly long over ocean routes. And of course, in recent years, the regulations have been loosened so they can fly twin engine jets over large oceans. But when this came out in the 70s, the restriction, I believe, was within 60 minutes of an airport if you only have 2 engines. So they wanted a more efficient airplane. They could not go with a 2-engine airplane at the time because that could not fly long over ocean routes. And 3 engines is still, although not as efficient as 2 engines, more efficient than 4 engines. So that's why you saw a lot of tri-jets in the late 60s, early 70s. And then later on in the 80s and 90s, once ETOPS regulations were loosened, you saw more twin-engine airplanes take over. And eventually these were phased out because twin-engine jets are more efficient than 3-engine jets. But this really made for a striking look. And the engine in this is actually nested towards the back part of the third, or the engine in the tail. It's actually pretty far back there. So a lot of times I'll get people asking where's the fan blade for it, and you actually have to look all the way down into the engine to see it all the way at the back. So it's a really neat effect, and it posed some challenges actually building this because it's pretty big and heavy, and it sits all the way back there at the tail, and it tends to want to cause the plane to be a little tail heavy, and it puts a lot of stress on that area. So the tail on this one actually had to be reinforced compared to a normal plane that doesn't have an engine in the tail. So that was a challenge that I had to overcome with this one.
And then that brings us to the wings section as well, which we haven't really touched on yet. So take us through some of the design kind of those on the real plane, and then how you captured that as well.
Yeah, so the wing on this one, I believe, was a slightly more advanced swept wing design. I'm not super in tune with the aerodynamics of this. I'm sure somebody in the comment section who's an aerospace engineer can figure that out. But I can say that the engines on this were pretty new for the time. They were high bypass turbofan engines, which basically allowed these large jets to exist at all, because before this you had low bypass turbofans and turbojets, which were significantly less powerful. They weren't able to deliver the thrust needed to get such a large plane off the ground, and this one was able to get away with just 3 engines, whereas previously the 707 had, in the DC-8, which for the Douglas Contemporary, had 4 engines, and it was about a third of the size of this airplane in terms of mass. So it really is impressive how engine technology took a real leap. And I guess we can come around the side here. I'll try to show the flaps on this. They're not the most complicated flaps I've ever done, but I can show you how they work if you want to try to get a little closer up on that. So these are just what's known as Fowler flaps, so they fold up and into the wing like that. Same thing with these. And then the flap tracks on the bottom can come up and fold straight into it. If I can find it, there we go. Perfect, yeah. So those are what's known as Fowler flaps, and this one isn't as complicated as the 747, although it does work pretty well, so I'm happy with how that turned out quite a bit. And sometimes I'll try to include spoilers on my plane, sometimes I'll try to include slats. On this one, I mostly just opted for flaps because I wanted this to be displayed in a takeoff configuration. So during a takeoff configuration, you would have the flaps down primarily, so that's what I wanted to show with this.
Fantastic work. Is there anything else you want to talk about before you take it down and we look inside?
Yeah, so I guess I'll try to demonstrate one of the doors here. I guess we can do this one at the back here, or yeah, wherever your camera is. And these are not typical airplane doors that swing out. They actually swing up and in. So I'm going to see if I can get this to work. Yeah, see, as you can see, it swings up and in like that. So yeah, a little bit unorthodox, but it works. And it was kind of tricky to incorporate into the design of this because you actually have to leave a lot of room above the door as well. And it also makes removing things a little more interesting, although I was able to work around that pretty well. So yeah, the doors are kind of a neat thing on this because you don't see a lot of planes nowadays that have doors that open like that. Most doors swing out. So that's a pretty cool little trick there.
Are any of these planes still operational today?
Not as passenger planes, although you will occasionally see the MD-11s, which are the stretched version of this airplane, as cargo planes. So UPS still flies them, FedEx still flies them, I believe. Some European carriers still fly them. So you can still see the silhouette of this airplane at a modern airport. It's definitely not used anymore as a passenger plane because most of these planes were produced in the early 70s. So a little bit ago. So it's a classic for sure. And I really wanted to try to capture that. And unfortunately, you don't see the chrome color scheme on most modern American Airlines planes. A lot of that's because they're composites now, and you can't get that if you wanted to. And they've really moved more towards just painting them gray and having the stripes. I don't think they still have the stripe running down the side. I think they just have the flag on the tail now. But this is really sort of the classic American Airlines livery, which is really what I was going for.
So we're ready to take a look inside the plane now. Where do you want to start here?
Yeah, so we'll just take the top of the plane off to get started. So I'll start with the front here. Comes off pretty easily. And we'll just pull a couple pins out. These pins are instrumental in keeping the plane from basically folding in on itself. And then I'll just pull the entire roof here off. Comes off pretty easily. Perfect. Set that down there. Looks like a small part came off here. Yeah. So there we go. Yep. So that reveals the entirety of the inside of the plane. You can see there are people in there and everything. So yeah, I guess we can start at the front here, where I unfortunately forgot to put pilot figures in there, but it gives you a better view as to what's actually in there. So here, I'll actually come around here so you can see in there a little better. We'll start in the back. That's the flight engineer position. That is where the flight engineer would sit, as the name suggests. You have the flight engineer that would monitor all of the engines. They would monitor the systems of the aircraft. This is basically stuff that would be handled today by a computer. But back in the 1970s, you did not have a computer that could run all these systems and all these checks on the engine. So you needed a third crew member that could basically monitor all that, control the engine fuel mixtures in older airplanes and all sorts of stuff. So as we move a little bit forward, you can see the captain on the right and the first officer on the left. I tried to include as much detail in here as I could. I have the flight yokes in there, some throttles, a little bit of a screen there that shows the instrument panel and whatnot. And since this is, of course, the 1970s, the door would not have been very securely locked, so it would probably be a little more accurate to have that open like that throughout the flight. But yeah, so that's the flight deck of the area. You have a small lavatory right here at the front for the pilots and first class passengers. And speaking of first class passengers, sorry about the noise around here, they're taking down the stanchions, but speaking of first class passengers, we have the first class area right here, which is not super first class by today's standards, but back then this would have been great. You would have had basically big armchairs. And at the very front, you have a small first class lounge. And back before the Emirates of today, this was the luxury of the day, trying to compete with the lounge on the upper deck of the 747. So back here, we have the galley. Now you might be asking, where is the galley? And that's a good question, because on the DC-10, the DC-10 actually had a below deck galley. So we can actually see that by, it's one of these, there we go, by removing a section right here. And that actually exposes the entire galley of this airplane. So we have a staircase over here that leads down into the galley. Got the elevators right there that can move transport food from the first level further up. And then along both sides, we have cabinets and drawers and carts that they would use to actually deliver the food to the passengers. And the way this would work is you would actually load the cart into the food elevator and it would take it up to the main level of the airplane. So it was actually pretty revolutionary for its time. And you sometimes see these. I think one modern plane might still have this, but I'm pretty sure both the DC-10 and the L-1011 have this feature. So that's actually a pretty neat feature that you don't see on most modern airplanes. So I really wanted to include that. This was actually pretty hard because there's a lot of technical stuff that runs below the deck, as well as structure, because that's where I run most of the structural beams for large planes like this, as I run them through the deck below the passenger cabin. So fitting this was pretty difficult, but I think it was really worth it because it's such a neat experience being able to just pull off a panel and show the inside of the below deck galley. So I think that was a really, really neat part of the airplane. And so if we go further back, got the first passenger cabin, and we're trying to be extra loud today, but we have, yeah, the first passenger cabin. And this color scheme was actually pretty common during the 1970s. The upholstery choice was supposed to be bright and vibrant, and they also a lot of times chose this so the cigarette ash and smoke would not ruin the color of the cabin. So that was one consideration during the time. But we have the burgundy carpets and the purple, yellow, and bright blue chairs and red chairs. So yeah, very striking, very 1970s. I wanted to really capture that because this is something you just don't see in modern airplanes. Nowadays, they're all gray, they're all tan, they're all blue. You don't see purple chairs and burgundy carpet.
I want fun chair colors to make a comeback on planes.
Oh, I agree with that. I want to be entertained when I get on the plane. So I actually think this was a pretty fun, look. Maybe would stand out a little bit today as being dated, but back then it was not dated. This was the leading edge back then. So yeah, I really wanted to include that. And this is another one of the reasons why I wanted to build an airplane from this specific era in aviation, because I could really get creative with the color scheme inside the airplane as well as outside of the airplane. So yeah, if we move a little bit further back, we've got the central wing exits here. These would only really be used in cases of emergencies, and the central bank of lavatories that would be for economy class passengers. 4 of them there. This is pretty typical for what you would see on a contemporary or a modern airplane. But also back in the 70s, this is how it pretty much was laid out. So if we move a little further back, we have the main, or the larger economy, or back then it was referred to as coach class cabin. And you can see you have an assortment of passengers. And this would not have been too far from what you would have seen back then. A lot of times the flights were not full, and you could get an entire row to yourself to maybe stretch out on, or maybe even try to get some sleep. You don't really see that nowadays. Back then it was not too uncommon. And it will try to come around the side here. And at the very back we have a door that is opened. We have what is a coach cab, or a coach what's it called? Lounge. Sorry, brain fart there. This is something you definitely don't see nowadays. The American Airlines experimented with this for a couple of years, and then they realized, hey, we can put more seats back here. Let's do that. So this was a pretty short-lived experiment, but I thought it was very cool that you had a coach class lounge for people who are in coach cabin versus just having a first class lounge for the first class passengers. So yeah, I've got some seating here. We've got some couches and some sectionals. We've got a table right there with the requisite Lego coffee mug. It is white, not red, but you know, still same thing. And of course, a couple more lavatories back there for the economy class cabin. So yeah, this was a pretty large airplane for its era, not as big as the 747, but it was actually fairly comfortable to ride in. Had a roomy cabin. It was pretty quiet compared to flying in a 707 DC-8 or other narrow bodies. And it was pretty revolutionary for its time. It's really a shame that it had so many issues early on that kind of tarnished its reputation in the eyes of the public, even though later on it would go on to have a safe and fairly successful career as a wide-body airliner for many airlines, including American Airlines. So yeah, I really wanted to capture truly that spirit of 1970s aviation here. And that I really feel like I was able to do that, especially once you open the lid up and you see what's inside. So
yeah, absolutely, just incredible work here. Thank you so much for not only building this, bringing it up to show, but taking so much time to take us through the build as well. So for people who haven't seen your work online as Big Planes, where can they find you and where are you most active online?
Yeah, so I'm primarily most active on YouTube. You can actually see the entire build process for this plane on YouTube. I'm also on Flickr as just Big Planes and on Instagram as BigPlanes_official. So, or I think it's just Big Planes Official. I have to check. But yeah, Big Planes, because I build big planes.
There you go. Perfect. Yep. Keep up the great work. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking to you guys, and I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing you guys at future shows and showing you future projects.